10 unsettling cases of famous people who disappeared. Sadly, many people go missing. Some of these people become very well known in the aftermath of their disappearances, but we're always left to wonder if the efforts to find them might have been more thorough, and possibly more successful, if they had been rich, powerful, or famous. As you'll see, even famous and powerful people vanish. Some are believed to be victims of crime, others are just the accidental missing. But despite any efforts to find the 10 famous individuals listed below, they were never heard from again. 1. Sean Flynn. Sean Flynn could have done anything he wanted. For a while he tried to be an actor like his swashbuckling father, Errol, but the passion that drove him was to work as a photographer covering America's deadly wars in Indochina. The dangerous, chaotic assignment brought him excitement and fame, but it also led him to his death. 40 years ago next week, Flynn and another journalist, Dana Stone, disappeared without trace after encountering a hostile checkpoint southeast of Phnom Penh. Now, forensic tests are to be performed on remains that have been dug up in rural Cambodia by 2 amateur bone hunters who claim they have finally answered the mystery as to what happened to the 2 men, among 36 journalists to have lost their lives during the war in Cambodia. John Johnson, a spokesman for the U.S. Embassy in Phnom Penh, said the remains had been sent to the Pentagon's Joint POW, MEO Counting Command, JPAC, located in Hawaii where the tests will be conducted. Last Friday, the possible remains were delivered to us and we have taken action, he said. It is hard to speculate how long the tests will take. All these cases are individual, yet the possible discovery of the remains of Flynn, who was aged 28 when he disappeared, has sparked controversy. Not only are the 2 men who made the find seeking to sell their story to the highest bidder, but a former colleague of the journalists believes the excavation of the burial site was conducted unprofessionally, and may have disturbed a larger grave in which the remains of other journalists may lie. The remains handed over to the U.S. authorities in Cambodia were found by Briton Keith Rotherham and Scottish-born Australian David Macmillan more than 2 weeks ago. Reports say they were alerted to the location in Kampong Cham province in eastern Cambodia by a local man, who claimed to have been a witness to the execution of a tall, blonde foreigner. The witness claimed the foreigner had been forced to dig his own grave before he was battered to death. The 2 men hired bomb disposal experts, a bulldozer and teams of local people to excavate the site in the village of Kadong, where they uncovered clothes, bone fragments and teeth. Contacted yesterday by The Independent, Mr. Rotherham, who runs a guest house in the town of Sihanoukville, refused to answer any questions about the discovery, the full story of which, he said, would be for the highest bidder. Mr. Macmillan claimed elsewhere that the 4-month search had been partly funded by Flynn's half-sister. Yet the excavation of the site has been criticized by a colleague of the journalists, who has led the search for them almost ever since they went missing. Tim Page, a British photographer celebrated for his work in Vietnam and other conflicts, said he believed a number of other foreign journalists may have been executed and buried at the same site. Mr. Page, 64, who is featured in Michael Hare's classic memoir of the Vietnam War, Dispatches, said he had led an excavation of the same site last year and found glass vials, bone fragments and teeth that he had handed to JPAC, along with GPS coordinates. He said it was vital a thorough examination of the site be conducted as local people claimed it held the remains of more than 1 foreigner killed by the Khmer Rouge. I have had hundreds of people contact me over the years about Sean and I'm always interested in what they have to say, Mr. Page, who now lives in Brisbane, told The Australian. But there is a very strict procedure to be followed when digging at a site of possible human remains. And in this case that has not been followed. It was not a forensic dig. They used an excavator and uncovered a full set of remains, which they removed from the site. Sean Flynn was the child of the famed leading man and his first wife, Lily D'Almeida, a French actress who spent huge sums of money to search for her son after he disappeared. Eventually, the photojournalist was declared officially dead in 1984. More than a dozen years after he was seized at a checkpoint and handed over to Khmer Rouge rebels. His mother died in 1994. The 1970 to 1975 conflict in Cambodia, a spillover of America's war against the North Vietnamese, pitched the U.S.-backed government headed by Lon Nol against Khmer Rouge insurgents supported by the government in Hanoi. The war was eventually won by the Maoist-influenced Khmer Rouge forces, which then put in place a murderous 4-year regime that caused the death of up to 2 million people. Flynn and Stone went missing on April 6, 1970. The former were on assignment for Time magazine and his colleague for CBS News. The two men were part of a larger group of journalists who had driven out of Phnom Penh on Highway 1, heading toward the Vietnamese city then called Saigon, for a press conference organized by the government. One of the last Westerners to see the men was Stephen Bell, a reporter with ABC News, who would later go on to anchor Good Morning America. Speaking last night from Indiana, Mr. Bell, who is now retired, said most of the reporters had traveled in large limousines, previously used by tourists but later taken over by the press corps. However, Flynn and Stone had been traveling by themselves on motorcycles. Afterwards we all headed back to Phnom Penh, but they said they wanted to go forward. They had heard there was a checkpoint that was manned by the Viet Cong. It was thought that you could see the Viet Cong there, said Mr. Bell, who took a photograph of the two men as they set off on what would be a final journey. We headed back to Phnom Penh and no one ever saw them again. I think they were among the first to go missing. It had not reached the point where we knew quite how dangerous it was, too. Oscar Zato Costa. Oscar Zato Costa, an outrageous lawyer who once subpoenaed every member of the Los Angeles County Grand Jury to prove a pattern of discrimination against Mexican Americans, is somewhat of a Chicano folk legend. He was a driven, hell-raising attorney who was involved in high-profile civil rights cases in Los Angeles in the late 1960s and early 70s and inspired the character of Dr. Gonzo in Hunter S. Thompson's surreal book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Acosta eventually gave up law and wrote 2 semi-autobiographical books, and then disappeared like a puff of smoke off the coast of Mazatlan, Mexico, in the spring of 1974, but not before leaving an indelible mark on the pages of LA political history and Chicano literature. His disappearance took place 3 years after the notorious drug-enhanced trip to Las Vegas. That is the subject of Thompson's book and the current Terry Gilliam movie starring Johnny Depp and Benicio del Toro. But the book completely obscured Acosta's background and the film only hints at his real story. The legend of Oscar Zato Costa, a compelling figure in Chicano history, remains in the shadows. In Fear and Loathing, the character of Dr. Gonzo, a man with a gargantuan appetite for food, drugs and dangerous living, is the perfect complement to Thompson's journalist alter ego, Raoul Duke, who uses his assignment to cover an off-road race as an excuse to overindulge in booze and drugs in Las Vegas. I recognized an Oscar who would push things one more notch toward the limit, said Thompson of his Mexican-American friend, who in the name of ambiguity liked to refer to himself as a 300-pound Samoan. You never knew with Oscar what was going to happen next. Acosta was an ambitious, hard-working man, born in El Paso, Texas, and raised in the San Joaquin Valley. He attended San Francisco State University, where he took up creative writing. After getting his law degree from the San Francisco Law School, he worked at the East Oakland Legal Aid Society, but eventually decided that rather than work within the system, he would use his law degree to challenge it. According to those who knew him, he was also restless, someone who was always looking for more out of life. The thing about him is that he never took things too seriously, said his son, Marco Acosta, 38, a San Francisco-based musician and vocational counselor, who manages his father's estate. Whenever he set out to do something, he went at it full force, but he was never satisfied with any one thing. Oscar Zato Costa's personal explorations of cultural identity and divergent career choices brought him to Los Angeles during the late 60s and early 70s, one of the most explosive periods in the city's political history. In 1968, 13 Chicano activists were indicted on conspiracy to disrupt the schools after a walkout by teachers and community members who were protesting educational inequality. In 1969, 2 Brown Berets were charged with felonies stemming from the disruption of a speech by then-Gov. Ronald Reagan at the Biltmore Hotel, and, in 1970, Los Angeles Times columnist Ruben Salazar was killed by a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy following a Vietnam War protest rally in East LA. Acosta was involved as defense attorney in the first 2 notorious cases, but his 1970 bid for sheriff of Los Angeles County, in which he won 500,000 votes, coming in second, is what assured him a place in Los Angeles political history. And it was Thompson's invitation to Vegas. The two had been introduced by a mutual friend that assured Acosta a place in U.S. literary history. I dragged Oscar away while he was working on the Biltmore 7 trial because we couldn't talk in that war zone, Thompson recalled. So I said, let's get the hell out of town. Thompson, a practitioner of the kind of new journalism that writers such as Tom Wolfe and Norman Mailer popularized in the 60s, said he was inspired by his adventures with Acosta to take his writing to a new level, hence the term gonzo journalism. It's Thompson's own take on a style of writing in which the journalist participates in his story's development. Thompson is damn talented and one of the best writers of his generation, but the book itself without Oscar would be like, taking the heart away from the book, said Del Toro. The Usual Suspects, Excess Baggage, who gained 45 pounds to more realistically portray the rotund lawyer. But in the book Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Duke refers to his associate as a Samoan, or something, never as a Mexican-American. So Gonzo is a character with no cultural context. The real Acosta is, in a sense, swallowed up by his alter ego, a man with no defined identity aside from his role as Duke's buddy. There's no point in the book that you ever realize this guy was a real lawyer and an activist, Del Toro said. I think that's a big part of the book that was missing, said Thompson of his work, which was first published in Rolling Stone in October 1971. In the film, however, director Gilliam and producer Leila Nabalsi opted to add that cultural context, in a sense bringing Acosta back out of the relative obscurity he sank into after his disappearance. Props used in production of the film are the only clues to Dr. Gonzo's true identity. In one scene, Duke phones Gonzo at his LA office. On Gonzo's walls are posters with the images of the United Farm Workers symbol and UFW leader Cesar Chavez's face. But Acosta told his own story. Just as Thompson was inspired by his adventures to write Fear and Loathing, Acosta too was inspired to document his experiences, most notably in two semi-fictionalized books, Autobiography of a Brown Buffalo, 1972, and Revolt of the Cockroach People, 1973, which his son is developing into feature films. Oscar had that kind of natural weird spirit, Thompson said. There aren't that many of us in the world, and we recognize each other. His writing was just an extension of that. In his 1995 book, Bandito, Oscar Zeta Acosta and the Chicano Experience, author Elon Stevens likens him to a flirtatious yet angry version of a streetcar named Desire's Stanley Kowalski, and it was Acosta's wild spirit and extreme persona that attracted Del Toro to the role of Dr. Gonzo. That, and Thompson's amazing written account of their friendship. According to the actor, Dr. Gonzo is all about rage, Del Toro said, and about forcing the silent majority to wake up. He's all about loathing, rage and complete disregard for authority were Acosta's trademarks. They're the stuff legends are made of, the kind of attributes that make some people larger than life. He would do things like drop me off at the airport in my rental car, and then 2 months later I'd get a bill for 3 weeks that he used the car, Thompson said, laughing at the memory. He'd forget to take it back. Acosta literally vanished without a trace. His body was never found and his family assumes he met a bad end in Mexico. Thompson speculated that he was either the victim of a political assassination or that he died at the hands of drug dealers. In the foreword to a reprint of Acosta's Revolt of the Cockroach People, Thompson summed up his friend's life. His birthday is not noted in any calendar, and his death is barely noticed. But the hole he left was a big one, and nobody even tried to sew it up. These days, that hole is still gaping, according to Thompson. For some horrible reason I miss him. I miss him like I miss the smell of tear gas. 3. Theodosia Buralston. Disappearances of famous people are nothing new, and incidents of mysterious vanishings go back for centuries. The details of such episodes are usually known, even when the explanations for the disappearances differ. Not so of the unknown fate of Theodosia Buralston, the daughter of the infamous Aaron Burr. Theodosia was born in June of 1783, and grew up as a daughter of the wealthy, and was educated in the fashion of the day. In 1801, she married Joseph Alston, a wealthy landowner who would go on to become governor of South Carolina. Theodosia continued to live a life of privilege and refinement. In 1803, Theodosia and Joseph welcomed their first child, a son named Aaron Burr Alston. Although Theodosia doted on her son, the pregnancy and birth had taken a toll on her previously fragile health. She made trips up and down the eastern seaboard to various physicians in fruitless attempts to regain her health. She experienced even more of a health collapse, both mental and physical, when her son died in June of 1812. As a proposed change of scene, in hopes of recovering from her loss, she decided to sail to New York to visit her father. On the last day of 1812, she boarded the schooner Patriot in South Carolina. The ship left dock and sailed north. It was never seen again. Although all of the crew and the passengers disappeared, the vanishing of Theodosia is the one that people still talk about today. Numerous theories have been put forward as to what happened to the 29-year-old member of high society. One of the most likely suggestions is that the Patriot fell victim to some military action related to the ongoing War of 1812. Perhaps the passenger ship was mistaken for a war vessel and was sunk by an enemy ship. Another somewhat similar scenario has the ship falling prey to pirates. They were known to sail in areas where the Patriot would be sailing, and there were also known land pirates in the area, lawless men who lured ships to sail too close to the shore where they were then boarded, looted, and the ship's occupants were killed or taken captive. This may be true. In 1910, a man told a story passed down in his family of the body of a woman washed ashore in the Carolina area in early 1813. Another unverified story that may be more legend than fact involves a locket engraved with Theodosia in the possession of a Karankawa Indian chief. The chief claimed he had rescued a young woman from a wrecked ship and she gave him the locket before dying. Author Charles Etienne Arthur Gaillard wrote that Theodosia met her death by being forced by pirates to walk the plank into the cold Atlantic Ocean. An assortment of stories involve a doctor being called to treat an elderly woman in the mid-19th century and was paid with an oil painting that is later found to be a portrait of Theodosia. A decidedly unromantic version of Theodosia's fate states plainly that the Patriot encountered foul weather and sank. It was later discovered that ships in the British fleet off the coast of North Carolina logged that they were hit by a severe storm in the first few days of 1813. Was Theodosia Burr Alston killed or captured by pirates? Was her ship sunk by an enemy force, or by a storm? Did she manage to survive only to die soon after, or did she live to an old age under a new identity? We may never know. All that is certain is that Theodosia's disappearance continues to be folklore actively related by residents of the area where she apparently met her ultimate fate. 4. Henry Hudson. It has been 400 years since English explorer Henry Hudson mapped the northeast coast of North America, leaving a wake of rivers and towns named in his honor. Yet what happened to the famed explorer remains a mystery. Hudson was never heard from again after a mutiny by his crew during a later voyage through northern Canada. That he died in the area in 1611 is a certainty, and he may have even been killed in cold blood. According to new research, the anger among Hudson's crew over his decision to continue exploring after the harsh winter could have easily fueled a murderous mutiny, suggests Peter Mancall, a professor of history at the University of Southern California. The full story of Hudson's saga reveals one of the darker chapters of the European Age of Discovery, said Mancall, who explores the 1610 voyage in his new book Fatal Journey, the final expedition of Henry Hudson. Before the fatal voyage that took his life, Henry Hudson found great success as a navigator the way many men did during the Age of Exploration, by accident. Hired by the Dutch East India Company to find a new passage to spice-rich Asia by way of the Arctic Ocean, Hudson was ultimately forced by impassable ice to seek another route south. Sailing into what would eventually be named the Hudson River in 1609, he did not find the Northwest Passage he was looking for, but did manage to stake the first loose claim to the territory, including the island of Manhattan, on behalf of the Netherlands. The value of the land he'd claimed for a foreign power wasn't lost on the rulers of his home country. Upon his return, England's Royal Council forbid Hudson from ever sailing under another flag, and he was sent back to the New World in 1610 aboard the English ship Discovery. Hudson's objective was, once again, to find a northern passage to the Orient, but he would never return from that trip. The Discovery docked back in London in 1611, without having reached Asia, without the captain aboard and with just 8 crew, all of whom were now subject to death by hanging for the murder. Some facts about the 1610 to 1611 voyage of the Discovery are certain. Discovery plied the Canadian bay that also took Hudson's name in the summer of 1610, the captain believing that he'd possibly found the elusive northern passage to the Pacific. The ship was forced to ground itself for the winter, however, with Hudson ordering the return to the route the next spring, despite his crew's wish to return to England. When the ship took to the water again for its return trip in June 1611, Hudson was not aboard. On trial for Hudson's murder later that year, the remaining crew admitted to cutting the captain, and a group of individuals still loyal to him loose on a small lifeboat. According to court documents, none of the men was convicted of the murder or even punished for the mutiny, and historians generally believe their claims, too. But some physical evidence points to a more violent end for the captain, Mankall believes. Mankall highlighted evidence that was found and documented after the ship docked in London, bloodstains, most damningly, along with letters from another sailor mentioning the growing personal rift between captain and crew. A number of Hudson's possessions were also missing, since Hudson's body was never found. However, it will never be known for sure whether the captain was murdered or given a more subtle death sentence, set adrift in the harsh environment of northern Canada. It was Hudson's steely nature to press on and meet his objective that led to his demise, whatever that may have been. Historians agree. Hudson was one of the most intrepid and important explorers of his age, said Mankall. He was not a man who easily gave up. 5. Solomon Northup. Historians know where Solomon Northup was born, where he lived and where he worked. They know whom he married and how many children he had. They know he played the fiddle and spent 12 years enslaved in the South before being freed. What historians don't know about the author of 12 Years a Slave is when and how he died and where he is buried. It's a lingering mystery in the final chapter of the life of the 19th century freeborn African American whose compelling account of enforced slavery in pre-Civil War Louisiana was made into the Oscar-winning film of the same title. That's sort of a big blank spot in the story, for sure, said Rachel Seligman, co-author of Solomon Northup, the complete story of the author of 12 Years a Slave, published last year. This month, 12 Years a Slave took home the Academy Awards for Best Picture, Best Adapted Screenplay and Best Supporting Actress. The accolades have sparked new interest in Northup's story, which was little known until recent years even in the upstate New York communities where he spent most of his life. Northup was born July 10, 1807, in what is now the Essex County town of Minerva, in the Adirondack Mountains. His father, a former slave, moved the family to neighboring Washington County, eventually settling in the village of Fort Edward, on the Hudson River 40 miles north of Albany. Northup married Ann Hampton in the late 1820s, and the couple lived in an 18th century house in Fort Edward that is now a museum. Northup worked on his father's farm and rafted timber on the Champlain Canal between Fort Edward and the southern end of Lake Champlain. The couple and their children moved to nearby Saratoga Springs when Ann got a job in one of the growing spa resort town's big hotels. Northup found work as a musician, and in 1841, two white men lured him to Washington, D.C., with the promise of more work. Instead, they kidnapped him and took him to New Orleans, where he was sold into slavery. Northup endured the next 12 years enslaved on a Louisiana cotton plantation before friends in Saratoga finally won his freedom. In 1853, he published a memoir of his ordeal that led to a speaking tour supported by abolitionists. He got involved in the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves find freedom in the Northeast and Canada. But around 1863, the height of the Civil War, he dropped out of sight and was never heard from again. Even the movie notes at the end that the date, location and circumstances of Northup's death remain unknown. Theories abound about what may have happened to him. One scenario has him being captured and killed while serving as a spy for the Union Army. The man who helped rescue him said he believed Northup had taken to drink and was kidnapped yet again, or Northup could have died in a place where no one knew him or cared to properly bury an African American at a time when a war over slavery was tearing the nation apart. He may have just wandered around from place to place and died somewhere nobody knew who he was, and he was buried in a potter's field, said David Fisk, co-author the 2013 Northup book along with Union College professor Clifford Brown. There's no paper trail for him, Brown added. Fisk said Northup's descendants also couldn't provide any documents or hard facts, so he has followed numerous threads while trying to track down where Northup may have been buried. He checked cemeteries and communities outside Saratoga and other upstate communities where Northup's wife and their children later lived, but came up empty. No death records have ever been found for him. Fisk, a former state librarian, points out that death records weren't kept in a systematic form in New York until the 1880s. For Seligman, a museum curator at Skidmore College, host of this July's annual Solomon Northup Day, the mystery surrounding Northup's demise and resting place is part of the allure of being a historian. It's what keeps historians going, she said. It's just a puzzle to be solved. 6. Heinrich Müller. Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller, the most senior Nazi whose fate has until now remained unknown, died in Berlin in 1945 and, in a chilling twist for an organizer of the Holocaust, lies in a Jewish cemetery, a German historian says. Müller, who ran the Gestapo secret police before and during World War II, was last spotted in Adolf Hitler's bunker in Berlin the day after the Nazi leader committed suicide in 1945. He was heard to say he would never let himself be captured by the Russians, but US and British investigators hunting fugitive Nazis after the war found no conclusive evidence that Müller had died in the fall of Berlin or had escaped to South America, as several other top Nazis did. Now Professor Johannes Tuchel says he has found proof that Müller did indeed die in Berlin in 1945, was first buried in a provisional grave in a garden in Luftwaffe headquarters, and then consigned to a mass grave in a Jewish cemetery in the city. From my point of view, all the mysteries around Heinrich Müller are solved, he told Reuters at the German Resistance Memorial Center in the Defense Ministry in Berlin, where German officers who tried to overthrow Hitler in 1944 were executed. As hands-on operational head of the Gestapo, Müller reported first to Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, until his assassination in Prague in 1942, and then to Heinrich Himmler, head of the paramilitary SS. Born in 1900, and decorated in the First World War, Müller became a policeman before Heydrich recruited him to the SS and Gestapo. He attended the 1942 Wannsee Conference which laid out the final solution, the plan to exterminate the Jews. Tuchel described Müller as a bureaucrat who, from behind his desk, was responsible, with Himmler, Hitler and Heydrich for a lot of mass crimes, was deeply involved in the Holocaust, attended the Wannsee Conference and was also responsible for the mass killings of Soviet prisoners of war. The historian was investigating one massacre ordered by Müller. When he came across documents about Müller's demise, he re-examined evidence from a gravedigger after the war, in then-communist East Germany, who remembered burying a man in a general's uniform in Berlin Mitte Jewish Cemetery in 1945. The East German police were not interested at the time, but Tuchel traced the documents and military decorations found on the body to archives in Berlin and crossed that with data from German intelligence and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. He concluded that Müller was dead and traced the corpse to the historic Jewish cemetery dating from the 17th century, where the Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelssohn was also buried. The cemetery was desecrated by the Nazis and became the site of 16 mass graves for more than 2,700 people who died in Allied air raids and the fall of Berlin. It is now a Jewish memorial. Dieter Grauman, chairman of the Central Council of Jews, said in a statement it was in outrageously bad taste that a brutal Nazi sadist should be buried in a Jewish cemetery. It's an insult to the memory of the victims, he said. But since Jewish religious law forbids exhumations and it would be difficult to identify one body among the thousands buried there, an air of mystery may linger over Müller. Legends don't die, and if someone says tomorrow he has seen Müller in the Arctic, I won't contradict it, Tuchel said. But historical study and speculation are very different things. 7. Harold Holt. In this weird world of ours, there's no shortage of weird to write about. I recently brought you the story of James Worson, who may or may not have been a fictional character dreamed up by the famed and mysterious in his own right, Ambrose Bierce. That post, and this one, are an exploration of strange disappearances. This one, however, concerns a disappearance that really did happen. There's no question, he disappeared and was never seen again, But the question is how and why. I'm talking about Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt. Any Aussie readers are most likely aware of who that is, but for those unfamiliar, Harold Holt was the 17th Prime Minister of Australia. He served as PM from January 26, 1966, until his disappearance on December 17, 1967, though he had held other political offices during his career, such as Minister of Scientific and Industrial Research, and Minister of Labour and National Resource. As politicians go, Holt was well liked and has been hailed as one of the best Labour ministers Australia has ever seen. There's more to the story than that, though. Holt was a man's man. He was an avid sportsman, snorkeler, spear fisherman, and strong swimmer, and on the lazy Sunday of December 17, 1967, he and two friends ventured to his favorite swimming spot at Cheviot Beach near Portsea, accompanied by his two regular bodyguards. The waters at Cheviot Beach are notoriously choppy and conceal a deadly riptide. It's said that the water was particularly rough that day, and despite warnings from his friends, Holt went for a swim anyway. After getting into trouble in the rough surf, Holt disappeared among the waves and was never seen again. A monumental search and rescue operation was immediately undertaken, involving the Royal Australian Navy and Air Force and a host of other military personnel and volunteers. Despite what ultimately became one of the largest search operations in Australian history, lasting for 22 days, no trace of Holt was ever found. Now, as that story is told, it seems fairly clear that he just suffered an unfortunate accident and was swept out to sea. After all, that is the official story. But you know it doesn't end there. 2 days later, the Australian government made a statement wherein they declared Holt presumed dead, although no official inquiry had been held. The Commonwealth and Victoria Police Departments produced a lengthy report on the matter, detailing eyewitness statements, weather conditions and the findings of the search operation. They also relayed that Holt was apparently suffering a shoulder injury that had nearly caused him to drown just 7 months earlier. Holt had also suffered some kind of collapse during Parliament that same year, later blaming a vitamin deficiency for the episode. This all seemed to confirm that his disappearance was the result of unfortunate circumstance, or as some would call it, death by misadventure. This official conclusion didn't sit well with a great many people though. Even at the time, conspiracy theorists were gearing up for the story of a lifetime. One of the first to come forward with a claim about Holt was a Swami of India who had heard of Holt's death and had apparently had a vision showing him where Holt's body was buried in the sand on the seafloor. A series of correspondences were exchanged between the Australian High Commission and an Indian Parliament member who represented the Swami, but of course, no body was ever found. That was just the tip of the iceberg though. It has since been claimed that Holt committed suicide, intentionally drowning himself, or that he faked his own death so that he might run off with his mistress. Perhaps the most entertaining claim is the one made by British journalist Anthony Gray, who, in his 1983 book The Prime Minister Was a Spy, Weidenfeld and Nicholson, made the outrageous assertion that Holt had been an operative of the People's Republic of China, and that his disappearance was all part of an operation to return to China. Gray claimed that his body was never found because he was picked up, very much alive, by a Chinese submarine that was waiting just outside Port Phillip Bay. Others claimed, of course, that he'd been abducted by a UFO, and John Keel wrote in his 1970 book Operation Trojan Horse, that elementals had foretold of Holt's death in conjunction with the Point Pleasant, Silver Bridge collapse just a year earlier. Keel's connecting of Holt and the Mothman prophecies has prompted others speculate that Holt may have been an alien representative on Earth. Whether that reasoning bears fruit or not, I'll leave up to you. In 2007 the suicide angle was furthered by journalist Trey Martin in his documentary Who Killed Harold Holt? And then again by the Australian weekly magazine, The Bulletin that same year. But there's at least one man who disagrees with their assessment. Gary Simmons takes the Harold Holt conspiracy theories to a whole new level. Simmons, who hails from Brisbane, Australia, claims, loudly, that Holt was murdered. I know that doesn't sound like it's really out there too far, but wait, it gets better. Simmons notes that an official inquiry into Holt's death wasn't conducted, that is until 2005, when the laws in Australia changed and allowed for a coroner's inquest. That inquest concluded that Holt's death was the result of accidental drowning, But it seems that this inquest was orchestrated to silence those people who supported the Chinese defection theory, and Simmons believes that all of this is subterfuge, covering the real events. On his website, Simmons explains, at length, that he believes Holt was murdered the night before he disappeared, on December 16. How does he know this? Why, it's because he was personally tasked with removing Holt's body from his house, and towing it out to sea to a waiting fishing boat that very evening. Simmons, it seems, is some sort of clandestine operative for the Australian government, or at least he believes he is. Simmons has undertaken a letter-writing campaign to several, nay, many personalities and offices within the Australian government and other world organizations. In those letters, which he dutifully scans and posts on his own website, he confesses to his involvement in the murder and even names other conspirators. He details where, when and how he handled Holt's lifeless body, and what its ultimate fate turned out to be, but it appears few people have given him any credit, and that may be due to the fact that he appears to be completely bonkers. On his website and in his letters, he frequently refers to a supreme second law of the universe, which he invokes as a defense for his actions, claiming immunity from prosecution or culpability or some such thing. And it has long been known that people whose personalities compel them to embark on letter-writing campaigns, such as Simmons has, tend to be a little unstable. He also frequently refers to they and them. He even includes the quotation marks, so either he doesn't know who opposes him, or no one does oppose him. Here's the problem though, he offers details, accurate details, details he apparently shouldn't know. He has offered affidavits and sworn statements to the coroner's office as a part of their inquiry, but he isn't being taken seriously. In response to this and all of the other conspiracy theorizing, the government of Australia, through the National Archives of Australia, has digitized and presented all of the original documentation surrounding all of the investigative efforts, inquiries and search efforts, and many other documents, via their website. Their archive provides hours of reading and an exploration of one of Australia's most beguiling mysteries. Their attempt to provide a little transparency for what has been and would otherwise be considered a very secretive series of events, does quite a bit to answer the call of conspiracy, but it certainly doesn't answer all of the questions surrounding the disappearance of Harold Holt. So, did Holt drown accidentally? Was he a Chinese spy, or an alien? Or was he murdered? I don't know, you tell me. 8. Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa, the controversial ex-Teamsters boss, was last seen outside the Mucus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Hills, an exclusive suburb of Detroit, at about 2:30 p.m. on July 30, 1975. According to members of his family, he had expected to meet with two mafia figures, Anthony Giacalone of Detroit and Anthony Provenzano of Union City, New Jersey. Neither man, who had well-established alibis, showed up. Federal investigators speculate, but have no proof, that Hoffa might have been picked up by his foster son, Charles Chucky O'Brien, who was driving a car owned by Giacalone's son that day. Many believe that Frank Sheeran, a former Teamster leader in Delaware and a close friend of Hoffa, lured Hoffa into the car for what would be a quick drive to a nearby residence. Supposedly, at this private home just a few minutes from the restaurant, an assassin, identified by federal prosecutors as Provenzano Lieutenant, and local 560 business agent Salvatore Sally Bugs Brigaglio, ambushed the former Teamsters president and shot him dead. Federal investigators speculate that 2 or 3 co-conspirators may have witnessed Brigaglio shoot and kill Hoffa. 2 of them have been identified as Gabriel Brigaglio, Sal's brother, and Thomas Andretta, another local 560 business agent. A 4th possible conspirator was Stephen Andretta, Thomas's brother, who allegedly served as Provenzano's alibi back in New Jersey. In October 1976, as part of my independent investigation of the Hoffa caper, I called the Union headquarters of Provenzano's Local 560 in Union City and asked to speak with the 48-year-old Salvatore Brigaglio. To my surprise, he agreed to the interview. At the appointed time, I arrived at the office's Local 560. After about a 20-minute wait, Brigaglio came through the door. Following close behind was his attorney, William Bufflino. I had known the boisterous, glad-handing, and heavyset Bufflino from my earlier work in Detroit, so he was particularly cordial when we shook hands. Brigaglio, a small and wiry man, was more laid back, just staring and sizing me up. "Join us for lunch across the street," Bufflino said cheerfully. Inside the restaurant, as the maitre d' led us down an aisle to a back room, I saw two other men seated at our table. No introductions necessary, I already knew who they were. The first was Brigaglio's brother, 31-year-old Gabriel, the vice president of the Provenzano-controlled Local 84 in Fort Lee and one of Sally Bugg's alleged co-conspirators in the Hoffa murder. The second man was 40-year-old Steve Andretta, a former Local 560 business agent and the brother of Tom Andretta, another alleged witness to the killing. After a 90-minute lunch, Bufflino and I left the restaurant and returned to Local 560. Because of another appointment, Gabe Brigaglio had to leave. During the lunch, he insisted that he had nothing to do with the Hoffa murder. Tom Andretta, whom I talked to on the telephone that afternoon, also denied any role in the murder. Led into the local union president's office by Bufflino, I pulled out my tape recorder and laid it on the table in full view of the others who soon walked in. Salvatore Provenzano, Tony's brother and the president of the local, who had not been present for the lunch, joined us, as did Sal Brigaglio and Steve Andretta. For the next 3.5 hours, I recorded the first and only taped interview with the man suspected to have murdered Jimmy Hoffa. Brigaglio was loud and defiant, refusing to admit that he had been involved in the Hoffa murder while I kept trying to prod him into a confession. Ever protective of his client, Bufflino, never known to be shy, kept trying to deflect the interview away from Brigaglio's alleged guilt and toward the government's allegedly illegal tactics to gather information, the subject I had supposedly come there to discuss. In response to my question about who was paying Bufflino's legal bills for his representation of Hoffa's alleged killers, the attorney replied, "If someday they have some money, they can pay me." If Hoffa were here right now, he'd say, "Continue to defend these people, they weren't the ones who did it." Also, I asked Bufflino whether his family relationship with mob boss Russell Bufflino was the reason he had been selected as counsel for them. Bufflino shot back, "If you want to charge me with something regarding Russell Bufflino, charge me with the fact that I selected him as my #1 friend. I would rather be accused of being his friend and brother by choice, not by an accident of birth." When I inquired of Salvatore Provenzano why his brother, Tony Pro, was being accused of engineering the Hoffa murder, he blanched. "Jimmy and my brother were friends to the very end. I have seen letters that Jimmy sent to Tony, but I can't show them to you. They burnt up when Tony's house went up in flames." Turning to Brigaglio, I said, "You are the main man in this whole thing. You're the person everyone alleges blew Hoffa's head off. How do you react to these allegations?" Brigaglio responded coolly, "They're very, very serious allegations, and I'm very, very concerned about them, of course. But I know since I had nothing to do with it, I'm not too concerned about it. But I'm still being hurt by the publicity that's being generated by it. That's the government's game plan, subpoena after subpoena. They haven't stopped, they aren't ever going to stop." Distressed about being recently indicted for a 16-year-old murder of a union rival, Brigaglio continued, "The government will say, although we didn't solve the Hoffa mystery, in order to justify the grand jury, we got this guy indicted on that, and the other guys on the other thing. In the meantime, the Hoffa grand jury is going to fizzle out." So, if you're asking me if I'm worried, the answer is, yes. I'm very, very worried and very, very concerned. I then asked Brigaglio how he came to be identified as Jimmy Hoffa's killer. He explained that in early December 1975, federal agents had roused Tony and Salvatore's brother, Nunzio Provenzano, the secretary-treasurer of Local 560, out of bed. Armed with subpoenas, the agents demanded access to a filing cabinet in the Union Hall often used by Sal Brigaglio. They were looking for two .38s with silencers, Brigaglio explained. They came in. They didn't find any. While government investigators searched through the Union Hall, other federal agents converged on the Garden State Bank across the street, holding subpoenas and demanding access to safety deposit boxes that had been rented by Steve Andretta and Gabe Brigaglio. This box I had only opened up 2 days prior, Andretta told me. This was the first time in my life I had opened a safety deposit box. He added that he used it to store his jewelry, 2 watches and 2 rings. You know what they found in Gabe's safety deposit box? Brigaglio asked. A sock. An old sock with some old coins in there. That's all they found. So that's another blank. God knows what they were looking for, the bastards, what they expected to find in there. However, he knew as well as I did, the FBI was looking for the weapon used to kill Jimmy Hoffa, pressing Brigaglio and Andretta as to how federal agents knew to target the Union file cabinet and the safety deposit boxes. Andretta, somewhat sheepishly, replied, "They asked me about my visit to prison." In August 1975, Andretta had visited Ralph Picardo, an old friend and convicted murderer, in the readjustment unit of the prison hospital at Trenton State Penitentiary. Andretta and Picardo talked on telephones and could see each other through a thick glass barrier. Federal agents have alleged that during this visit, Andretta gave up the details of the Hoffa murder to Picardo. After receiving this information, Picardo made a beeline to the closest federal prosecutor and tried to make a deal to get out of prison. During his subsequent appearance before the federal grand jury, Andretta testified under a forced grant of immunity. "I was highly insulted," Andretta told me. "I never discussed anything about Hoffa with Picardo. Picardo is trying to use us to bargain his way out of jail." Consequently, cited with contempt for refusing to answer questions, Andretta spent 63 days in Michigan's Milan prison. I asked Andretta what he was asked during the grand jury hearing. Andretta replied, "What did Sal Brigaglio do with Hoffa's body? What did my brother do with the body? What did Tony Provenzano do with the body? What did Gabe Brigaglio do with the body?" After Andretta's release, Tony Provenzano threw a party for him and gave him a new Cadillac. They spent $10 million trying to throw Hoffa in jail, Andretta said bitterly. And now they've spent a figure close to it, trying to find out what happened to him. And they're trying to get anybody involved in it for whatever reasons they want. They're very embarrassed. When I asked Brigaglio, who revealed that he had been identified as a target of the Hoffa probe during a September 8, 1975, solo appearance before the federal grand jury in Detroit, where he was at the time of Hoffa's disappearance, he replied that he was playing Greek rummy in the local 560 Union Hall with his 2 alleged co-conspirators, Gabe Brigaglio and Tom Andretta, as well as Tony Provenzano and other Union officials. However, later on in the interview, Brigaglio, who said he had personally known Hoffa very well, contradicted that version, saying that he had left local 560 earlier in the day, because of a flaring pain in his mouth after oral surgery the previous day. In a final denial to committing the murder, Brigaglio said, "I wish they would find out who did it, so they would take the heat off me and Tony Provenzano. Other than that, I don't even know if the guy is dead. The government is on a fishing expedition. I don't know anyone in the world who would want to hurt Jimmy. He wasn't a threat to anyone to my knowledge. There has to be law enforcement, but not like this when they go out and solicit phony witnesses to make a target out of certain individuals. What the FBI wants is a Brigaglio or a Provenzano, any name they can build up. They build you up to knock you down, so they can make a name for themselves." On March 21, 1978, 2 unidentified men walked up to Brigaglio in New York's Little Italy and knocked him to the sidewalk. Then, they pulled out their guns and shot him 5 times in the head and once in the chest. The murder remains officially unsolved. I had again talked to Brigaglio in another recorded interview a month before his murder. Many, including his bosses in the underworld, believed that Brigaglio, who was under indictment for the murder of a Union rival, was on the verge of flipping. During that final interview, Brigaglio, worn and tired, showing the strain of the enormous federal pressure he was under, told me, "I've got no regrets, except for getting involved in this mess with the government. If they want you, you're theirs. I have no aspirations anymore. I've gone as far as I can go in this union. There's nothing left." 40 years after Hoffa disappeared, although the case officially remains unsolved, the government still believes that Salvatore Brigaglio murdered Jimmy Hoffa, and so do I. 9. Glenn Miller. 70 years before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 became the biggest, most sophisticated plane to ever disappear, A plane carrying bandleader Glenn Miller vanished during World War II. Miller was one of the most popular musicians of the 1930s and 1940s, with songs such as In the Mood and Moonlight Serenade. His single-engine Return Norseman disappeared in bad weather, presumably going down in the English Channel, while heading to a Christmas Day concert for troops in Paris in 1944. But the plane and its 3 occupants were never found. Questions lingering through the decades include whether the plane suffered mechanical problems, or was shot down by friendly fire. Books have also speculated Miller was a spy against the Germans or died under scandalous circumstances. The PBS program History Detectives Special Investigations, The Disappearance of Glenn Miller will explore the mystery Tuesday at 9 p.m. ET. This was a celebrity story about a guy who was in essence a rock star of his time. He was every bit as big as the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, said Wes Cowan, one of the program's hosts. He joins the Army Air Force to be a patriot and poof, he vanishes. The beloved and bespectacled Miller was more famous than anyone aboard the Malaysia flight, which took off March 8 with 239 people aboard, but his flight attracted much less attention immediately. Miller had joined the Army in 1942. At the age of 38 and performed with his Army Air Force Band to boost troop morale. With a friend, he hitched a ride December 15 on a UC-64 Norseman that left a Royal Air Force field called Twinwood Farm. Foggy, freezing weather should have prevented the flight, just as a snowstorm should have grounded musician Buddy Holly before his fatal crash in Iowa 14 years later. But Miller was eager to reach Paris for a concert celebrating the troops who had arrived since D-Day months earlier. They never should have been flying that day, Cowan said. They had no permission to fly. About the same time Miller's plane was heading to France, a bombing mission was returning from Germany with its payload because the weather was too stormy to spot targets. But those Lancaster bombers dropped their explosives over the channel before landing, leading to speculation they might have inadvertently hit Miller's plane. The program has taped interviews with a British accident investigator, who reviewed the case in the 1980s. And a possible witness to explore this option. Co-hosts Tukafu Zuberi and Kayama Glover help narrow down what might have happened. But one of the frustrations of the case is that a detailed investigation came long after the disappearance. The flight occurred on the eve of a German offensive now known as the Battle of the Bulge, which began the next day and raged for more than a month. A revelation came in January 2012, when the Journal of an Amateur Plane Spotter was unearthed, and offered new information about the plane's path. And the show explores speculation that has developed over the decades, including the fact that Miller made German-language music recordings during the war that some have suggested could have conveyed hidden spy messages. Miller also worked with David Niven, the British actor who served as a commando during the war and coordinated with American forces. The show offers a little something for big band fans, aviation enthusiasts and those who love a mystery. I think it's an interesting story about a guy who was at the top of his game and wanted to do something for his country, Cowan said. They paid the ultimate price for hubris. 10. Amelia Earhart. The mystery of Amelia Earhart has captured the imagination of young and old, amateur and professional, since she disappeared on July 2, 1937, on her flight over the Pacific, which would complete her around-the-world flight, the longest, following the equatorial route, and the first by a woman. From the time of her first ride in an airplane as a child, Amelia Earhart was hooked on flying. Her passion led her to break flight records and become a public celebrity. In one of her letters, she hoped that the around-the-world flight would finally rid her of her compulsion to fly and she could settle down. Though she did not survive it, it was indeed her last flight. She vanished into the Pacific Ocean 24 hours after leaving Lee, New Guinea. Crossing the 2,500-mile Pacific was the most dangerous part of her flight. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca was standing off Howland Island for several days to act as a radio contact for her. Radio communications in the area were very poor and the Itasca was overwhelmed with commercial radio traffic as a result of the celebrated flight. She and her navigator, Fred Noonan, left with 1,100 gallons of fuel, good for around 24 hours of flight. The flight should have been about 19 hours, but she ran out of fuel 2 hours early. She carried as much as possible. The plane was so heavy on takeoff she wasn't sure even to the end if she could get it off the runway. Their intended destination was Howland Island, a tiny piece of land a few miles long, 20 feet high, and 556 miles away. Their last positive position report and sighting were over the Nubian Islands. About 800 miles into the flight, after 4 hours and 18 minutes, she called in and reported her speed and height, the right speed and height for optimal fuel consumption. Management tables had been prepared for Earhart by Lockheed's Kelly Johnson. She signed off with her signature line, "Everything okay?" There is disagreement over what happened next. The theory put forward by Elgin M. Long is that a combination of weather and equipment failure forced her to use more fuel than expected and come in toward Howland Island too far north. First, the storm forced her to go higher to avoid it. The climbing used a great deal of fuel and then she had to fight a strong headwind. This also used more fuel. After 10 hours they spotted a ship, which they assumed was the halfway marker. Instead it was probably a different ship farther north. She spoke to Leo Bellertz on the Ithaca, but she was apparently unable to hear him as he attempted to guide her in. He sent Morse code, but she had left her Morse code equipment behind. She was 100 miles from Howland Island, but her radio direction finder was malfunctioning. If it was clear, they could have seen Howland Island from 50 feet or more if high enough, and they would almost certainly have found it. But because of the weather they could not find it. She sent her last message giving her position as she plunged into the water. As she reached to crank the transmitter, the engine coughed. The long theory is that they died on impact or drowned. When last heard from at 8:43 on July 2nd, 20 hours and 13 minutes into the flight, Earhart said she was flying on a 157-337 line. The USCG Itasca's radio log. Earhart and Noonan had a poor understanding of the use of radio navigation, and to keep the plane as light as possible, some equipment was left behind. The frequencies Earhart was using were not well suited to direction finding. She had left behind the lower frequency reception and transmission equipment which might have enabled Itasca to locate her, and the reception quality of her transmissions was poor. Two-way communication proved impossible. An 8-page letter written days after the disappearance by Eric Chater, general manager of Guinea Airways and Earhart's host in Lee. The letter, which describes in detail the preparations made and the difficulties experienced by Earhart and Noonan prior to departure, had been misfiled by the recipient and only surfaced in 1992. That, and the Itasca's radio log, now in the National Archives, help answer some questions which were unclear for so long. Earhart specifically said she would use Greenwich time during the flight. She did not know that Itasca was, nevertheless, using local time. Earhart also expected that the Itasca would follow her requested radio schedule in which she listened for messages on the hour and the half hour, and transmitted messages at 1/4 to and 1/4 past the hour. As the Itasca's code message was being sent on 7,500 kilocycles, they could not send voice on 7,500. Earhart was tuning her receiver to 3,105 to listen on the half hour. When the Itasca's transmission ended at 23:58, 11:28 for Earhart, she probably didn't even have her headphones on. Not only was the weather being sent on the wrong frequency, but Earhart had repeatedly asked the Coast Guard to report in English, not code, especially while I am flying. Neither she nor Noonan could read Morse code, and the Morse equipment had been removed from the plane before takeoff. From Itasca's radio log, a group determined the precise location that she went down from, turning her signal strength into nautical miles. It is apparent that they were flying a ladder search pattern in their attempt to find the island. If they had not run out of fuel, the pattern would have taken them right over the island. With the aid of a sophisticated computer program, Nauticos, the deep-sea exploration company that found the Titanic, using the Long's research, has identified a search area for the Electra at 17,000 feet. The search is underway. Another group, TIE, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, has a different view of what happened to Earhart. They believe that the aircraft landed successfully on the reef flat at Nicamero Island at or near low tide on the smooth stretch of coral just north of the SS Norwich City, a ship that ran aground there in 1929. TIE Executive Director Rick Gillespie and his team have been investigating Nicamero Island for over a decade. A telegram dated July 3, 1937, to the Secretary of State reveals that on the evening of July 2, the radio station on the island of Nauru, which had heard Earhart's in-flight transmissions the night before, hears fairly strong signals, speech not intelligible, no hum of plane in background, but voice similar to that emitted from plane in flight last night. The signals are heard on 6,210 kilocycles, the frequency to which Earhart said she was switching in her 843 transmission. Early settlers on Nicomereau tell of an airplane wreck seen in 1940, long before any possibility of WEI activity. The wreckage is said to have been located on the reef near where the waves break and just north of the shipwreck. In 1991, while conducting excavations at a site on Nicomereau, Tyre found shoe fragments, a cat's paw replacement heel, most of a rubber sole, and a brass shoelace eyelet. The cat's paw manufacturer had identified the heel as dating from the mid-1930s and the sole, which aligns with the nail holes in the heel, as probably coming from the woman's Blucher Oxford shoe. Analysis showed the shoe to be a size 9. Photographs of Earhart taken shortly before her flight show her wearing Blucher Oxford-style shoes with brass shoelace eyelets, and what may be a recently replaced heel, due to the lighter shade of the lower heel. However, Earhart had a small foot, size 6. Gallagher found bones in 1940, and corresponded by radio with Turawa et al. He reported at first that natives had discovered a human skull, just possibly that of Amelia Earhart. He was asked by the Western Pacific High Commission to keep the information secret and to see what else he could find out. He next reported, "Thorough search has now produced more bones, including lower jaw, part of a shoe, a bottle and a sextant box. It would appear that A. skeleton is possibly that of a woman, B. shoe was a woman's and probably size 10, C. sextant box has 2 numbers on it, 3,500, stenciled, and 1,542 sextant being old-fashioned and probably painted over with black enamel." The bones found on the island by Gallagher and sent by him to Fiji were intercepted and analyzed by Dr. Lindsay Isaac of Tawara in an unauthorized examination. With unknown methods, he concluded that the bones were from an elderly Polynesian male. The bones went on to their proper destination on Fiji. They were analyzed in 1941, by Dr. D.W. Hoodless. He concluded that the incomplete skeleton was most likely that of a short, stocky European, or half-caste, and definitely a male. He recorded his measurements and observations, and his handwritten notes survive. Reanalysis in 1997 by Tyre, using Dr. Hoodless's measurements and observations but applying modern forensic methods, came up with different conclusions. They concluded that the skeleton was more likely female than male, more likely white than Polynesian or other Pacific Islander, most likely between 5 feet 5 inches and 5 feet 9 inches in height. In short, consistent with Amelia Earhart. But there is a low level of certainty. Both the Long and the Tyre theories have evidence to support them. Both claim to have solved the mystery. In time it should become clear which theory is correct, and the Amelia Earhart mystery can finally be laid to rest.